Just got a couple more people trickling in. Give it one more minute, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, looks like we are at a good number to start. Welcome everyone to today's DOSITS webinar series. This is the second talk in our 2025 webinar series. Today's webinar will be on Project WOW, that's Wildlife and Offshore Wind, collaborative research on offshore wind to advance integrated risk framework. Today we have Dr. Aaron Rice here to talk to us. But before we go ahead and introduce him, we are just have a couple preamble talks and bookkeeping items to go over with all of our participants. So if you are joining us today over Zoom, you should see something like this in front of you on your screen. There is a tab down here for audio settings. So if you would like to turn on closed captioning for yourself, you can go ahead and choose to do so there. And then you'll also notice there is a chat box function and a Q&A panel function. The chat box function here is mostly for you to just talk amongst yourselves, say hello. Anything in that chat will just be informal. But then if you have a question for our speaker today, please go ahead and post that in the Q&A panel section. You should see something like, if you click on that button on the bottom of your screen, you should see something like this pop up, and it's a Q&A panel. You can type in your question in the box and hit send. That question will then pop up for myself and among our panelists, and we will do our best to answer that throughout the talk without distracting our speaker. If the question is something that is very specific to the webinar, and we want the speaker to answer it directly, we will have a 5 to 10 minute Q&A session at the end of the webinar where we can get a direct answer from our speaker on those questions. Any other questions would then go in the Q&A when we will compile those and send them out with the answers after the webinar closes today. If you're joining us over YouTube, we also want to have your feedback included. So you can type something in the YouTube comment chat here on the right. Our panelists will collect that and add that to the Q&A, so you'll included as well. That brings us to today's webinar. Today we have, again, Project WOW, collaborative research on offshore wind to advance integrated risk framework. Our speaker today is Dr. Aaron Rice, who is a principal ecologist at the K. Liza Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Aaron's research focuses on using conservation technology to understand the ecology and evolution of acoustic communication in aquatic vertebrates. And he's interested in studying how bioacoustics can provide actionable conservation and management information for mitigating impacts to vulnerable species. So with that, I'm going to pass over the reins to Aaron to share his slides. And Aaron, I just want to say thank you for joining us today. And thank you for taking on this webinar.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. How's that look?
Looks great. Ready to go.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. I use DOSITS as an extensive resource for both my own research and teaching, and I'm always happy to be able to give back and engage with the broader community. And so I spend most of my time either listening for fish or for whales around the world. But for this presentation today, I'm sort of representing a much larger team effort. The PI on this Department of Energy funded project, Doug Nowacek, is literally in New York Bight right now tagging fin whales for the project. And so he couldn't be here. And instead, he asked me to present on behalf of the team. And so we have this Project WOW, which was created or funded through a Department of Energy RFP a few years ago, trying to identify possible impacts to offshore wildlife from renewable energy. And there were two projects that were funded. One was for the U.S. Atlantic coast. The other one was for the Pacific coast. And so our efforts here are really focusing on offshore wind development and environmental consequences along the Atlantic. And so, at its core, the fundamental question of the project is fairly simple, is trying to understand what, if any, impacts are there from offshore wind to offshore wildlife. And as you will see, trying to coherently answer that question through empirical evidence is astonishingly challenging. And to date, despite all of the regulatory and conservation concern over offshore wind development for whales, for impacts to whales and birds and bats, there is astonishingly very little empirical evidence pointing to things one way or the other. And so, as you will see from the description of our effort here, is really trying to answer some of those really fundamental questions. And so, the team itself, we have the privilege of working with a really diverse group of participants on the team from a large area. Oh, there we are. From all over the world, including North America, the UK. We have academic institutions, we have NGOs, and all of us are interfacing closely with federal and state regulatory agencies. And each, by bringing together this diverse team, we're able to bring a bunch of different perspectives and skill sets and provide really an integrated framework for answering these complex questions through a variety of different methodologies. For many of you that work in offshore environmental assessments, if you're lucky, maybe you can get two, maybe three sort of data streams as part of that project. And here we're able to bring a bunch more together that allows us to answer a lot of questions that we normally wouldn't be able to under the more traditional smaller scale projects. And so the overarching questions that we have are trying to assess the opportunity to mitigate or understand possible impacts of construction noise on different marine species, both above and below the surface of the water. Do those construction activities cause any changes in the habitat or patterns of species use habitat use or behavior in not only the offshore lease areas, but also surrounding areas? And then in the case of birds and bats, evaluate the opportunity or the potential for collision risk with operating turbines. And a lot of this is the challenge really becomes trying to have sufficient data before construction starts to be able to have enough data for appropriate inference for any sort of cause and effect or relationship between the two. We know that these species, one, have lots of data gaps in their behavior and their ecology. It's changing on a year-to-year basis. And so trying to understand what are long-term directional patterns in movements or behavior and try to decouple that with shorter-term effects from things like offshore wind. And that is no tricky issue. No, not a straightforward thing to resolve. So the project itself has two main phases. One was when we started trying to do a gap analysis and conceptual framework development for saying, okay, what are the data that are out there? What's missing? And how can we, in an ideal world, once we start bringing together these different data streams, how can we start to put these things together to allow us to actually have appropriate inference for impact or no impact. And then the second phase is targeted data collection and technology validation. So once we sort of had this framework developed and trying to understand how we were going to go about answering questions. Then it became trying to collect very specific data streams, bringing those together, and as part of that, bringing in some new technologies that had not been previously used. And I'll talk about some of those in some upcoming slides. But it is sort of being able to rely on tr uh, well demonstrated techniques like passive acoustic monitoring, aerial surveys, GPS tagging for birds, as well as some new approaches that haven't been evaluated as strongly, and seeing, which of these things provides the most payoff and which combination of different methods and which combination of data streams provides the most effective understanding for these overarching questions. So, as you might imagine, in trying to understand what is environmental risk to protected species and how do we go about doing that, um, there are a bunch of different levels, conceptual levels, and analytical approaches for how you would go about doing this. And so there are things ranging from the qualitative all the way down to quantification of absolute risks, being and processes in between. We have this idea of scoping and delimiting things like the potential stressor risk space. And this is where a lot of the work in offshore wind currently is, where for the previous, call it 10 plus years, along the US Atlantic coast, BOEM, DOE, and NIMS have been trying to understand, okay, well, if a wind farm is built in this designated lease area, what might the impact to whales be? And it's sort of like really having that scoping potential in the absence or preceding the actual construction events. And then once we start getting into actual mechanisms of risk, then there is evaluating sort of the highest and lowest likelihood and the consequences of risk. Much of the effort, as we'll talk about, has been focused on noise-related impacts from monopile pile driving and those foundations with the turbines themselves. But there are other anthropogenic signatures associated with the construction and operation effort. And you can see too that, in terms of this time course, the different, where you are within the development cycle of the wind farm aligns with some of these different thematic areas within risk assessment. So it's, somewhat obvious that you can't quantify the impacts from a wind farm before it has been developed. And so that's where, this prospective permitting and planning aligns with the scoping of potential risks. And then once you actually have construction efforts, then we can be able to do this sort of retrospective analysis and validation over what did we see, what changed in comparing the pre, during, and post-construction efforts. And we also have the opportunity to bring in both single species evaluations as well as multi-species, more community level analyses. And within sort of this risk framework, I'm going to show you a couple of different slides here on how we approach this, but we did use several different traditional risk assessment frameworks commonly used in environmental planning, ranging from one OERC, occurrence, exposure, response, and consequences, to risk-based approaches and structured scoring, and then also bringing in some of the PCOD or the population consequences of disturbance frameworks for evaluating things like noise and the upstream consequences to those populations. But in terms of the occurrence, exposure, response, consequences would look something like this, where through a scoping analysis, we would identify what are those possible threats, what might happen with the varying stimuli resulting from that, and then through that evaluate, what's the severity of this risk? Does it, can we assess it? Do we need to assess it, or is it something that's out of the scope? And then being able to sort of work through from scoping to risk analysis and then getting into evaluation for either modeling or analyzing empirical data for what is the risk for different stages and what might those actions be, either from a management perspective or a forward-looking data collection perspective. And then we can sort of have a feedback loop of being able to use data gaps or actions from that evaluation and feedback into further scoping efforts. And when we think about, the different ways in which animals might be impacted, would look something like this, where we can look at occurrence, in a particular area that overlaps with offshore wind development. Um, not surprisingly, there's a bunch of different reasons why particular species may be using a habitat that overlaps with offshore wind, or they may change their pattern of habitat use that has nothing to do with the offshore wind development itself. And so bringing in habitat models and environmental covariates to contextualize temporal and spatial patterns of space use allows us to combine these sort of correlative approaches to start inferring causality, and then bringing in aspects of exposure from offshore wind construction and operation activities to develop either exposure scenarios or an exposure model for how those are interacting with animal space use, and then evaluating the response in terms of are we looking at a lethal or sublethal response? Are the response acute or chronic? And how might there be either immediate effects or protracted effects affecting things like the quote unquote vital rates or aspects of survival, fecundity, animal health, and these then feed into a model of population stability. And you can see on the right, we have some of these more regulatory metrics associated with various phases of impact assessment. And this, again, highlights the complexity in trying to effectively answer the question of does offshore wind construction impact ocean wildlife populations? And so, with a lot of steps to this, it is where it's really helpful to have this combined modeling and empirical framework to address these things. So with Project WOW, what we've been able to focus on are two areas, one within the Massachusetts, Rhode Island offshore wind energy area, as well as New York Bight, each with multiple stakeholders and developers. For the Massachusetts, Rhode Island area, trying to focus on Vineyard Wind 1 project site and deploying sensors and tagging effort around that particular project location. And then for the New York Bight, really focusing on the Empire Wind lease area, sort of up in this triangle here. We had collected data, started collection for data in Massachusetts last year. And then we're just starting data collection this year for the Empire Wind project. And one thing to highlight too is that a lot of our field activities and data collection efforts have been done in close collaboration with the developers and the industry companies themselves. They've been extremely helpful with maintaining clear and transparent communication with the team, being able to provide data, provide insights, and really help make this a collaborative effort between science and industry to sort of have maximum benefit to the projects. When we think about this development cycle of offshore wind and the possible environmental consequences to it, this whole cycle starts, many years out from when you actually see wind turbines in the water, with the idea of site selection and licensing. Once those two things happen, we get into geophysical and geotechnical surveys. These do have a stressor component and noise signatures associated with it. Once the bottom type is assessed, we get into the engineering and planning for the design, the foundation type. Then we get into financing well before the actual construction and then operation happen. So, the planning and implementation phase of the wind farm is, well over 10 years before the wind farm itself is up and running. And then the operational phase, may be permitted for 25 to 40 plus years, depending, before that offshore wind site is decommissioned and site remediation happens. And certainly there are lots of lessons learned from the European experience with offshore wind development and what can be inferred for U.S. waters. The challenge has been a mismatch between those species that we have in the Western North Atlantic, largely the large baleen whale species that occur here with those species that occur in Europe. So there's a lot that we can understand in terms of uh, sound propagation, noise levels, impacts to some species, namely odontocetes and seals and birds. But then there are still no empirical data for what happens to baleen whale species. And so being able to, there is a generalizability of these project development cycles for ocean offshore renewable energy projects around the world. But then there are certain specificities for trying to understand these things within U.S. waters and the Western Atlantic. So from the perspective of geophysical and geotechnical surveys would look something like this. You would have some aspect of acoustic emission for scouting the site using either multi-beam or side-scan sonar. So this would be a high-frequency noise used to visualize or image the seafloor and identifying sediment type, rugosity, where foundations could go. And then sort of the geotechnical survey being able to start getting into sediment coring to see what is below that seafloor surface and what the foundation may actually go into. Each of these things do have different noise profiles. Sediment coring is going to be much lower in frequency. The sonars, two sonars are going to be higher frequency. They would look something like this with a multi. Here is a spectrogram on the bottom here with and a waveform with this image from DOSITS within the audio gallery of a multi-beam echo sander. And you can see, so this is a frequency scale versus time. And we have these acoustic signatures of the sonar at about 12 kilohertz. So well above what we think is the primary hearing range for baleen whales, but direct overlap with the hearing range for the toothed whales. Um, and what you can see here is that with these different sources used with the different surveys they correspond to different frequency ranges. So the multi-beam sonar would have operational frequency range between 1 and 400 kilohertz or 100 and 400 kilohertz. The echo sounders are 2 to 22 kilohertz. Some of the chirping sonars have a lower frequency component going all the way down to 400 hertz. And so each of these different types of survey equipment would have has the possibility for insonifying or impacting different uh, categories of animals. I was going to say classes, but not in a taxonomic sense, but different types of species assemblages for what they can hear. And this may result in something like auditory injury or communication masking. There may be various things going on in terms of how these anthropogenic stimuli may affect whales or other species. Once the site selection has been profiled, then we actually get into installing the foundation. So these are three pictures from different projects. The one on the left is a Polish wind farm from Baltic Power. The one in the middle is Revolution Wind. In Rhode Island, the Massachusetts Rhode Island area, I think. And then the one on the right is from the Scottish wind farm of Moray West. And you can see that there are both, some similarities as well as some structural differences between the size of the vessel being used, what the foundation looks like, how it's installed. But much of these right now are being installed through impact-based pile driving. Think of hitting using a hammer to hit a nail into a piece of wood, where it's really using that sort of impact to then put the monopile foundation into the seafloor. Those have significant noise contributions to them. So pile driving, most of the energy is below 500 hertz, so sort of in that lower frequency range, with source levels of between 215 to 220 decibels at the source. That sound does attenuate at some of these thresholds, regulatory thresholds for marine mammals, but can be detectable out to many kilometers from the source. And so again, with some of these data here, you can start to see where is the source level ranging from 185 decibels at the low frequencies. Your peak frequency right here is this 210 to 220, and then a drop off. at the higher frequencies, and these source levels will also depend on the sediment type. So very coarse sand would have high absorption, lower levels, whereas some of the fine sand would have higher levels, and then certainly if you get into a rocky substrate, that may create more reflection as well. With these impact noises going hitting the turbine, you'll see a strong sort of impulse here in the waveform. Here again is the spectrogram, and so the strike itself is here, and then there is a sort of reverberation or echo visible in the spectrogram itself with decreasing sound levels as that persists. Once we get into the foundations being installed and the wind farm being up and running, we would look at something like this, where the majority of concern for offshore wind operational noise is sound radiating through the foundation out into the water column. Though there may be above surface of the water noises associated with the gearbox and the generator, or structure or surface waves hitting the foundation itself. But then again, here you see this sound radiation going between the surface of the water and the seafloor. And what this looks like, here's another example from the DOSITS website of what this would look like, both in terms of the waveform. It's relatively constant. And then here's the spectrogram, where it's sort of a low frequency, sort of broadband hum, a peak frequency around 100 or so hertz, but most of the energy is below 700 hertz. So this sort of sets the stage for the types of stressors and possible impacts that we would be looking at for offshore wind. And in order to address these questions, and in the context of possible consequences to wildlife species, these are just a snapshot of all the methods being used to answer these questions. So it ranges from focal on-animal tagging, aerial surveys, photogrammetry with pictures taken from either vessels or airplanes trying to quantify animal health. We get into a couple different types of passive acoustic monitoring, either with bottom-mounted units doing detection and localization. We have a couple of different real-time devices that I'll talk about shortly. Using these sounds, we can then do sound propagation modeling to figure out how is the sound behaving from construction sound related sounds and pile driving. And then we get into biological assays and samples, being able to bring together some of the acoustic and visual survey data and tag data to then start doing mapping and hotspot analysis, combining that with oceanographic sampling to look at environmental correlates that explain or correlate with patterns of animal space use, and then really getting into some of these covariate analysis and risk frameworks and trying to use different combinations of these methods to study whales, birds, and bats. Those are sort of the focal species assemblages for this project, and then focusing, within whales or birds, really having a couple focal species there that we can do a lot of investigation on, and then use that to generalize for the broader species cohort. So just to give you a snapshot of what some of the fun of this looks like when out at sea, being able to deploy tags through drones. The drone is launched off of this sailing vessel owned by IFAW. The tag is then dropped onto the back of the whale, sticks on with suction cups, and is a new advance for being able to minimize handling stress and increase the probability of successful tag placement on the whale itself. It stays right on the back. And has enabled quite a bit of data collection that I'll show you shortly. And then an example of photogrammetry, being able to sort of have a picture of a whale here. This is probably a fin whale, where you could then look at sort of the length of the animal, the width or the girth of the animal, and sort of start to infer its nutritional or health state from those images. And then and then this guy, the Snotbot, being able to use drones to capture small, basically biological samples from the blow of the whale, and do it remotely, and being able to fly the drone through it to be able to then collect sufficient not tissue, but fluid samples from the animal for hormone analysis. Um, and then here's an example of this Medusa unit deployed by Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and developed by Loggerhead Instruments that allows real-time streaming. Um, and then so what the drone tag delivery would look something like this. Hopefully it's not too choppy. And so you can see that the drone is able to get really close to the animal. The animal doesn't really notice. There's the blow, and then it swims away. And so it provides a really nice way to non-invasively get close to the animal and collect things with minimal impact. Fin whales were one of our focal species because of their high level of abundance in both project areas. And so being able to do on animal acoustic recording tags. They will yield species-specific vocalizations with confirmed identity of the species, which is something that's difficult often to get with bottom-mounted archival units. And so, looking at this fin whale here, you can see a variety of different call types, excuse me, that fin whales produce with quite a bit of variability. And so this now allows us to contextualize some of these sounds with the archival passive acoustic data stream. And so I'll show you momentarily what some of these data look like with respect to the swimming behavior of the animal, but being able to look at what are the calls the animal's producing, what's the source level, and then look at how noise may impact the either calling or swimming behavior. We did quite a bit of double tagging for on different whale species. So both putting a aerial, excuse me, the D tag or the acoustic recording tag, as well as what are called splash tags on the animal. So here's the drone flying over, and then being able to then sort of have a tag like this with a video stream. Which is pretty cool. And then being able to have a GPS information on the tag, so we know what's the swimming profile of the animal, where is it going, and then being able to combine that with the acoustic information being collected by the D tag allows us to understand how is the animal moving in the context of what calls is it producing. For this real-time device that we use, that's an archival unit. Come on, is this thing the Medusa? So our work done by Cornell in the Massachusetts Bay shipping lanes. Our auto buoys are in the many hundreds of thousands of dollars for a single location. Now the idea with Loggerhead Instruments and this Medusa are really to decrease those costs for real-time or detection by orders of magnitude. So, thinking, below $10,000 a unit. And so evaluating, could we in fact use something like this low-cost near real-time device, either in a fixed position or drifting position, and evaluate, is it in fact effective for detecting things like North Atlantic right whales or fin whales. And so these are highlights from a presentation done by Hui. That you can start to see that the way this would work is it would have the buoy at the top and can transmit through the surface. And then there's an embedded convolutional neural net or AI model that can do basically on-device detection and processing and then transmit those detection events back to a human for validation. And so these sort of give you an idea of what these two different configurations would look like. If you had the moored buoy, a line would go down to the seafloor and go to an anchor. The drifting variant is not tethered to the bottom and can go with the currents. And so we were able to evaluate the precision recall of the onboard AI for detection, and that's been quite effective. And we've now done a few different summers of field validation in and around the Massachusetts area. Going above the surface of the water to birds, one of the focal species has been northern gannets, and trying to understand their patterns of space use and how might that impact or be affected by turbine placement. And so this is work being led by the Biodiversity Research Institute and their collaborators. They were able to deploy 60 GPS tags on northern gannets on these locations, both in Cape Cod and Long Island. And in 2023, we're able to deploy 15, and then in 2025, they were able to deploy 45 units or 45 tags on animals. And the mean tag duration was about 32 days, but a range from 2 to 95 days of recording. And so the 2023 deployments looked like this, where we can actually figure out and track where animals are moving. You can see that gannets are mostly coastal at certain times of the year, but will go offshore. There's overlap with the Massachusetts, Rhode Island offshore wind area. And you are then also in the South Atlantic Bight seeing various offshore forays. And then what this begins to look like is in the upper right, you can see the tag duration by the month when the animal was captured and tagged. And then in the lower right, these are the total number of tracking days across individuals. And so, quite a bit of information on these guys, as well as being able to get their diving behavior. If we look at the patterns of gannet movement as it relates to some of the various offshore wind project areas, looks something like this, where you can start to see the number of individuals having overlap with Vineyard Wind 1 was 7 individuals, South Fork 2, but then Revolution Empire and Atlantic Shores are above 10. And you can see a number of flights and movements above or near some of these offshore wind areas, and then being able to take some of these data and getting into risk assessment frameworks. I'm not going to, get into the details on either this risk framework or something like this, but being able just to highlight a variety of different approaches of developing models based on empirical data and using various approaches to identify risk and possible impacts of things like gannets and other seabirds. Diving below the surface of the water, just want to highlight some of the results from the tagging effort in New York Bight from 2023 and 2024, led by WCS, but having a variety of different scientists involved. So you can see in and around the New York Bight area. These are tag locations from one individual. Empire Wind is right up here, but this particular individual is on some of these more southerly wind areas in New York Bight. But then we can also look at patterns of diving behavior. And so you can see that for fin whales, diving down to 35 meters over time with and having surface intervals again, and then also appearing to have some sort of diel pattern to diving during the day, staying relatively shallow at night, and then diving again early morning. But you can see a variable dive profile over these 168 hours. And then looking at sort of the trajectory of movements of a couple of different tagged individuals looks something like this, where this individual kind of just took off, was tagged in and around New York Bight, and then went out into the middle of the Western North Atlantic. Whereas this animal for tag 2 really kind of hung out for a while in and around some of these other lease areas. And so quite a bit of variability in species behavior and movement. And so this again provides really important context to where animals may go and what their baseline patterns of movement are before we get into actual construction season. So one might imagine that the false inference would be if this animal was tagged during construction, that, oh, hey, it took off. The sounds from pile driving sort of chased it away. But you can see that, well, no, well before any construction activity was happening, this animal just went south in a fairly directional pattern. And so this gives us better insights for the quote unquote normal or non-impacted aspects of animal movement that we can then have a better understanding for evaluating actual impact. Super fast highlight just on the passive acoustic monitoring. So as you might imagine, the Massachusetts, Rhode Island wind energy areas are somewhat noisy. So here is just an example of a daily spectrogram generated through Manta, showing 24 hours of recording with lots of vessel traffic. and some higher frequency noise with various activities. This is again is before pile driving was occurring, and most of the noise you can see from this power spectral density plot with frequency versus decibels on the y-axis shows the majority of energy in the lower frequencies. So um, looking at the time, I've raced through things here, but certainly want to thank DOSITS and the opportunity to present a lot of this work. Certainly need to thank the members of the team for which I am just a single project participant, but it's this collaborative team effort really makes this kind of this project possible. And then thanks to Department of Energy and to BOEM for taking interest and continuing to support this work. So I will stop there and happily take questions.
All right. Thank you, Aaron. That was a really informative presentation. We had a couple questions in the Q&A chat, but we fielded them. So if there are any questions from the audience and you would like to answer them, actually, you could just raise your hand and I'll allow you to speak, or you can just pop your questions in the chat now and we'll have Aaron answer them. Um, otherwise, um, Otherwise, we can just move on to the post webinar topics. We'll give a couple minutes for people to ask questions here.
So the question was, were GPS tags used on bats? Embarrassingly, I can't remember off the top of my head. I can look. I think most of that was passive acoustic detection, but I will have to double check.
One question is, were there aerial surveys for baleen whales?
Yes.
Yes.
So those were aircraft-based surveys done by the New England Aquarium, doing the standard protocol for aerial surveys in the Massachusetts, Rhode Island lease areas, and largely being able to sort of count and identify anything from the surface. But again, primarily focused on baleen whales, but also toothed whales as well.
All right. Thank you. We have a couple questions in the webinar chat as well, so I'll just read them aloud.
Mhm.
One person asked, will there be a secondary study for breeding or calving seasons of the whales?
So the goal is, I mean, certainly that's a great question. The goal is to keep this effort going as long as possible. It's a 6-year funded project with various stages for field work and then interpretation of the data. So for things like North Atlantic right whales, they tend to calve down in and around the southeast of the U.S., going South Carolina down to Florida. To my knowledge, I'm not sure where fin whales are calving. Maybe somebody in the audience knows. But the calving specifically is outside the scope of the project, since the Massachusetts and New York areas are not known calving grounds. But that being said, when animals are migrating through there with calves, the presence of calves is most certainly noted by the aerial survey teams.
Great answer. Okay, we have one more question in the Q&A. Are there examples of how some of these data actually resulted in changes to proposed wind farm footprint or lease areas? And would these data be published or publicly available any?
So this is a great question. So, some of it is being able to, so at a high level, um, data like these have most certainly have informed and guided and created modifications in the scoping of the wind farm footprint and the construction seasonality. So, work done 5 or 10 years ago identified when was there a prominence in or a higher probability of whales going through project areas, notably the North Atlantic right whale, and that then created a seasonal restriction for when pile driving activities could occur. And so, really using data, whether it's passive acoustics or aerial survey data, in an adaptive management framework of being able to use new and the best scientific information to guide effective installation and at the same time minimize risk to protected species. Where we are in terms of the alignment of the offshore wind project development with this research effort is that the projects were largely, have been planned, their construction schedules were set, and so we were using this as an opportunity to identify what's happening now. But my anticipation is that the lessons learned from this project, both on the science and management side of things, as well as the industry side of things, will guide future offshore wind projects, not only along the U.S. Coasts, but also around the world. And so, part of the goal here too is to be able to have these data publicly accessible, have data products disseminated both through the scientific literature as well as public formats like DOSITS. So you might imagine that a year from now, 2 years from now, myself or someone from the project team would be able to give a recap on saying, okay, you remember that Aaron rambled on about what the goals of Project WOW were. Now here's actually what we found from this 6 year effort. And so it's sort of a continuous process of being able to collect new data and interpret complex ecological problems as quickly as possible. And I wish it was easier and faster than it unfortunately is.
That's a great answer. Thank you very much. And I mean, you're pointing to exactly the kinds of issues that we deal with in any kind of long-term study like this. And of course, offshore wind being sort of in its infancy in the United States, but we do, like you mentioned earlier, we do have a lot to learn from what's happened in Europe with offshore wind and a lot of the studies that have happened there. But of course, in the U.S., we have many different species to consider and a much larger area that's being covered.
Mhm.
So we have a couple more questions. People are really putting them in now. So I believe you touched on this a little bit, but it would be good to get a clear answer for the chat. Does any part of the project coincide with the actual construction and observations of, sort of real time or real world responses um, to the construction seasons?
Yeah, so that's a great and important question. So thank you for asking that. The answer is yes. And so the timing of the activities of our data collection activities, one were to be able to sort of get equipment out before construction started, get some baseline data, and then go back during construction activities. And so we've got animal tags on whales when construction was happening. The passive acoustic monitoring units were in the water when construction was happening, both for Massachusetts last year with the construction of Vineyard Wind 1, as well as we are planning on the implementation of Empire Wind. We had planned on a May 1 construction date. To put things mildly, some politics happened, but now Empire Wind 1 is back online and moving forward. And so we are positioned to be able to collect data during that construction as well. And I think the real challenge would be able to do some of these post-construction monitoring efforts as well to say, okay, yes, it's absolutely important to see what impacts construction has in the short term on whales, birds, and bats. But then also, what are these longer term responses that we need to be aware of, such that, do ecological impacts, persist months to years after construction happens? Or is it just a short-term response and disruption, and then the animals go back to doing their thing? There's evidence and arguments for both. I'm not going to weigh in and say which I think is going to happen, but it is, right now there's not a clear consensus on what the most likely long versus short-term impacts may be and what is going to be more severe. But that's certainly one of the things that we hope to be able to identify.
Right, great answer. And I think one of our panelists, Kathy Vignes-Raposa, would also like to uh, chime in and answer this question live. Kathy, do you have anything to add?
No, thank you. I was just indicating that Aaron had answered the questions as you were going through. So just to help you keep track. Sorry.
Okay. Oh, no problem. These are some great questions. So we have a couple more here. A couple questions about the West Coast, and I know that they've eyed floating wind as a sort of solution for the West Coast with deeper waters. And I know that the wind farms are much the permitting process, or they're much further or earlier on in the permitting process there. But do you think that something similar data collection would be possible, or of interest for offshore wind construction on the West Coast, where there may be things like floating offshore wind platforms or other types of non-monopile type offshore wind platforms?
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges with this is that the industry is also moving fast, and I don't say that in casting any sort of negative opinion about offshore wind. But like the technologies are changing so fast, and so when a lot of the concerns over environmental impact and sort of being able to develop that conceptual risk framework was really around monopile foundations. And since a lot of that effort and thinking had started, yes, you're now seeing the emergence of floating turbines. You're seeing various like gravity-driven foundations, a bunch of different technologies that get around monopile foundations. And so, I mean, I think being able to be sort of prudent from an environmental planning perspective and being able to do risk assessments. I mean, I do think there are certainly likely advantages from a noise perspective on what floating turbines may do to pile driving. But at the same time, then there's going to be other possible risks or trade-offs with different types of foundations, how they operate, where they can be deployed. And so I think there may be some advantages environmentally from a noise perspective with floating wind farms compared to pile driving, but that doesn't mean that they are the panacea for reducing human wildlife space conflicts.
All right, these are really great questions and really great answers. I think we have time for one more. Let's pick one here. We have a couple in the webinar chat as well. Let's go with Gail's question. Is there a good cooperative relationship with professional groups which do the population studies of whale species? And I know this is sort of a harder question maybe, but is there a way to sort of reproduce these studies and make sure that, to make sure that the reproduction remains on the same track? So
Yeah, I mean, so that's also part of like being able to sort of do this in a open and reproducible science framework. And so, one of the mandates from DOE is that the data and data products will become publicly accessible through this by having a large collaborative team. There's the ability to sort of have different perspectives, try different approaches on working through the data, but then being able to provide some of the initial results for other people to be able to work with to try to either have different insights from different methods that were outside the scope of what we had the time or capacity to do, or to look at different information that different methods could yield. And so I think this is also where the transparency and the open dissemination of data and data products will lead to better answers rather than just sort of keeping it within the group. Oh, to be able to, the whales are reproducing. So I think that's also too, sort of mentally pivot in real time. I think the advantage too of also having this large group is that we know, who all of the players are, sort of in the field, and everybody has different working relationships, not only with groups involved in Project WOW, but who have direct relevance to Project WOW. And what we can begin to do is being able to, for folks dealing with reproduction in different areas, bring in some of those data and contextualize it with the data that we're collecting, share our data back out to be able to look at some of these other life history events and consequences outside of the initial project site. I think from a management and regulatory perspective, because these focal project areas are not calving grounds or reproductive grounds or breeding grounds for the whales. That wasn't in the immediate concern of the regulators. But that being said, being able to say, look, okay, if there are longer term ecological consequences, might that have life history or reproductive consequences down the road? And that's something that certainly our data can help inform.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and thank you so much for your webinar and your great answers to these questions. And thank you to all of our participants for asking these great questions. There was certainly a lot to discuss here at the end, but we are running out of time, so I'm just going to share this screen here. So once again, thank you to Aaron and to all of our participants today for this wonderful webinar. Please continue to join us for the next one. If you joined us over Zoom today and you registered with an email beforehand, you will receive an email with details about the questionnaire and survey that you should fill out. The questionnaire and the survey, both they are separate links in the email. They both help us improve the quality of our webinars as well as make this a more enjoyable experience for our participants. And then the questionnaire, if you can fill out, if you register for all 4 webinars in the 2025 webinar series and you fill out the questionnaire after each one, then you will receive the professional development certificate at the end of the webinar series in October. So if that's you, great job. If for those of you who want to go back and watch the previous webinars, maybe you didn't join, they are posted online and recorded for you to watch on the DOSITS website. So please join us for our next webinar. The next webinar is in September 10 at noon Eastern Standard Time. And the webinar is Sound and Signal, How Fishes Hear and Communicate Through Sound. So for those of you who joined today, please register, come back for the one in September, and we would like to see as many of you again for that webinar asking the wonderful questions that you asked today. So with that concludes today's webinar. We'll stay on to, as people flood out, but yeah. Thank you to all of our participants and to our speaker once again.
Hi, Kaylee. There's a question about accessing the questionnaire for previous webinars. Are they on the DOSITS websites, or is it an email that needs to get sent?
They're on the DOSITS websites, on the webinars themselves.
Okay.
There should be links to the Q&A on the webpage for each webinar.
Any other last minute questions? Aaron, you have received many kudos in the chat, so thank you very much for that presentation.
Always nice to see. Glad I didn't bring in any shame or embarrassment to the team.
They loved you. Thank you. We really appreciate you stepping in.
My pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
It was fantastic. And we had a lot of people tuning in. So.
That's great.
There's a lot of people saving their questions for
right to the end. That's I'm still like trying to capture everything to make sure that I've got them because they were in the chat and the Q&A too.
Yes, always.
I think I've got everything.
Yeah, I was trying to get people to pass it over, but
I saw that just as you were putting that in, I was also typing. So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also did a copy on my end, so I think we should be fine.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
And
yeah, great job,
I'll
Aaron.
listen to the transcript or listen to the video and transcribe the questions. There might have been a few that came in at the end that didn't quite get answered, but I think for the most part we've got everybody. But we'll send out a Word document with any of the unanswered questions.
Cool.
I'm sure they're.
Yeah, I did try to wrap a couple of them together in the same question.
I noticed that, yeah. So I'll work on massaging all that before we. But I think we've got answers to pretty much everything.
Yeah, I think so.
All right.
Great.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Really.
Okay,
Thanks,
bye.
Thanks for your help.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a great day.
Thanks.